Hello, class, and welcome back. This week we're going to be talking about reverse proxies and how do we work with multiple subservers, and particularly with Squid reverse proxy. Now, to understand the basics of running multiple servers as well as reverse proxies and what those are, we first have to talk about running multiple virtual hosts on Apache in a multi-server design. We talked about that a little bit already about how you can run multiple servers from your one server, but we're going to explain that a little bit more. Also, we're going to look at how we can understand the difference between a reverse proxy and a forward proxy and their purposes for being deployed, as well as configuring Squid in accelerator mode, which is reverse proxy mode for Squid, and finally observing cache behavior in practice. So, where are we so far? So far, we've learned about the HTTP fundamentals and the different versions of HTTP when we first set up Apache Web Server. We've also learned about how to implement HTTPS and enable different modules in Apache in order to make it more secure, but also how we enable modules as a whole and TLS encryption. Now, in this module, we're going to end up adding another layer where we add a proxy layer in front of the server and show how to serve multiple subservers, because Apache can serve multiple servers from your server without having to change any configuration besides the virtual host. And it's a very beneficial feature we learned last time. So, just a little bit of a recap on that. What is a virtual host in Apache? It allows you to host multiple sites from one IP address, and it makes it so that you have routing based on the host header that you actually enter. And it actually makes it so that you can have a different structure of your default web server versus your named virtual host. And this kind of forms a foundation for proxy routing, as it allows us to route to multiple subhosts based on the fact that we can have these virtual hosts. Now, one of the first models that we learn and we work with when we're working with web servers is the direct access model, which is what we've been doing so far. And this is where a client connects directly to Apache web server. Now, this is fine, but there's benefits to adding reverse proxies and other services in front of your web server, which we'll talk about in a second. But in this model, each server is exposed to the internet and there's limited scalability and flexibility. Now, what is a reverse proxy? You've heard this term probably before. You've heard me mention it a few times now. But a reverse proxy is what sits in front of a server. It's actually what a lot of times you end up connecting with and actually caches content or stores it so that you can access it more quickly, so you don't have to constantly reach that backend server. And it's often the public-facing entry point that you'll find out for a lot of different web architecture. Now, normally it's going to route the request to the appropriate backend web server, and you as a client are never going to see the backend server or what's going on in this process. It's all going to look like the web server to you. And this makes it so it's overall a lot more efficient, because we can end up putting content also here that we think that people might interact with or want. And this is an idea of edge computing that is brought up a lot more in cloud computing, but also works for web servers by having this reverse proxy server in front of our web server itself. Now, what's the difference between a reverse and a forward proxy? Well, a forward proxy is on the client side or outbound traffic. So think of it that you have to contact the forward proxy in order to send your traffic out. And it's a good way to filter it to make sure you're not having bad things being sent back and forth between different things in your client server architecture. Then you also have the reverse proxy, which is on the server side, or inbound traffic, where it makes it so that anything coming towards your server instead hits this, and if they need to, it can contact the backend server. And there's different use cases for both of them. Sometimes you might want it, like I said, for forwarding traffic or going through for outbound traffic. It's really good so that you can end up making sure that things are efficiently routed that way too. Now, why would I want to use a reverse proxy? Well, like I said, it hides the backend server and centralizes routing logic. It makes it so that there's one point everything funnels into, and it makes it so, like I said, you can enable caching and performance improvements by storing this content, so it takes less hops to get to the server. Hops mean in terms of how many routers do I have to hit before I finally get routed to my web server. And this makes it so that it prepares for scaling and load balancing a lot better overall. And you'll see this if you take the cloud classes too. We end up trying to use this approach with something called CloudFront, where we put it in front of our server architecture and try to cache it there so it's a lot more available. Because with web servers, high availability is one of your most important aspects to keep in mind. Now, Squid operates in accelerator mode as well as a few other modes, but we're mainly going to focus on it in accelerator mode, as well as how we can use it as a reverse proxy. Now, I skipped over forward proxies because we're not going to really cover too much in this class, but I recommend you look into it a little bit more just to see what options are really out there for you overall in terms of building your architecture, because it's good to play around with a lot of these at home because you can deploy them in smaller scale environments. Now, Squid in accelerator mode is going to act as a reverse proxy. It makes it so that you can cache peer to define backend behaviors and then route traffic by destination domains. And it makes it so that you can have optimal caching of responses and the networking of your environment overall. Now, this kind of leads us to the idea of the split domain architecture, where you have multiple domains, but it all goes to different backends. And sometimes you want this for a single IP address we've seen. And the routing can be handled entirely by the reverse proxy in this manner. Now, in our lab, we're going to have it so that the client, or Squid, is going to be our reverse proxy. And there's going to be two backend servers that it'll route to, backend server 1 and backend server 2. Keep that in mind, that it's going to route this way. But we're going to end up assuming that this is similar to what you might see out in the wild. Now, for caching versus non-caching, these are two different modes that you have for your Squid accelerator. Now, one way that you can end up running it is non-caching. This is just pure routing, just handles your traffic. And this is perfectly fine if you want to handle this way, but caching is good because we want to end up seeing what exactly is going in and handle some of the different aspects of our web server. And this reduces some of the backend load because we can store content. And it's really reliable for static content, but it can be dangerous and problematic in dynamic and authorization content because it ends up making it so that you have a lot of overhead to your environment, as well as it can cause misconfigurations. And this brings us to the idea of logging and observing caching, as well as observing architecture as a whole. So we haven't talked about security too much besides encrypting traffic. Logs are really useful in a lot of ways. Now, in Apache, your default access logs are going to be stored in var/log/apache2/access.log. And actually, a lot of your logs for your system overall are going to be in var/log. Now, there's also something besides your access logs, which shows who does what, when, and where when they access your web server. You also have the error log, which is good for you to actually check, because if you're having errors in your web server, that probably means there's something going on that you need to fix. And you can actually specify the log format as well as specific logs with custom log and error log in your site's config. So in the site's available configuration file, you can actually specify how you want these logs to be handled, and you can actually log rotate where you can actually have it handled through here and use different logging files. And it actually makes it so you can actually version and go over time and look at these. Really nice feature. Now with Squid, primarily you're going to have request logs or who tried to access it. And this is going to be in var/log again, but this time it's going to be under the application's name squid/access.log. And it's going to show exactly the same thing. Who accessed, what URL, status, bytes, timing, all the good stuff that you want to see when you're trying to log traffic and see who accessed your architecture. And also, there's this idea of the cache logs that you can see what's cached or the stored log content. And this also is often, especially in Ubuntu, keep in mind most of these that I'm stating are for Ubuntu. So if you're in a different operating system, it might be different. But in Ubuntu, the cache logs are going to be stored in var/log/squid/cache.log. And this will be any of your startup/caching related event logs. And you can format this too, again, with the log format and access_log in squid.conf. So with the Squid configuration file, you're going to be able to manage a lot of this. And keep this in mind because Squid is one way to use a reverse proxy. In the second half of this course, we're going to go over Nginx, and a lot more people are using Nginx, but it's a lot simpler to start learning this using Apache and Squid, and then moving on to what the industry standard, which is Nginx, is now. So that's why we're looking at this first, but keep in mind, we'll also be looking at how this actually works with reverse proxying in the Nginx environment, because it's not just a reverse proxy with Nginx, it's also a web server too, all baked into one. It has a lot of functionality. Now, why does this matter? Well, first off, with logging, you can end up using it for troubleshooting. You can see what issues are going on. You can see maybe if somebody ended up entering the wrong command somewhere, the wrong configuration, you can go back and see what happened. But for the exact same vein, you can see what happened with security and forensics. So you can see what the bad guys entered, what happened, who was attacking you, where did they attack you from. You can also see how well is your environment performing, and is it performing using the protocols and standards that you set forth, as well as up to the capacity. And then finally, you always want compliance and auditing of your environment as a whole, and you can set this up to either be automated by using other services or reading these log files that you have here and having automated policy based on this being created, or you can end up using it and integrating it with different softwares that are available for you, such as different IDS and IPS softwares to read the log files from Apache. So, like I said, looking ahead, Nginx is the modern standard for reverse proxies, and it's a lot simpler configuration with proxy paths in some manners. It's a lot less clunky than Squid. You'll see that when we do this lab, it feels like there's a lot more configuration that we add versus what we do when we end up trying to use Nginx. And Nginx also has something that a lot of people like called the Nginx Proxy Manager, or NPM, and it has a GUI-based option for managing your different environments with the proxy, so you can go either from HTTP to HTTPS or handle routing throughout your environment, because this is a very important overall for web servers. So with that in mind, we've kind of covered everything for the lecture, and we have a few review questions. So same as last time, I'll end up asking and giving you a few seconds if you want to pause, think about it, and then see if you have the correct answer. So first off, where is Apache's default access log and error logs located on Ubuntu? So the logs for Apache are stored in var/log/Apache2, and then it's named for the appropriate object. So access log and error log both live in here. Now, the next question, what's the difference between a forward and a reverse proxy? So forward proxy sits in front of the client and makes requests on their behalf to the internet and has everything filtered through there, whereas a reverse proxy sits in front of the server and handles client requests on the server's behalf. And then the last question, where are Squid's default access logs stored? So if you remember from before, typically the access logs are stored under var/log, and in this case it's stored under var/log/squid/access.log. So that's our lecture for today. That wraps up everything. We went over a good amount. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I'll see you all in the lab.